Hello, everyone, and welcome to State of the Hack 2.0. Now, the former viewers among you are probably wondering, who are we? I think this is a perfect time to introduce our new set of State of the Hack hosts. And who better to start us off than Mr. Doug Bienstock. Doug, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, why you're a fan of the State of the Hack series, and what you're hoping to bring to it, and what you hope to sort of steer it in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. So I'm Doug Bienstock, and I am a manager here at Mandiant. And I've been with Mandiant for a little over 6 years now. I actually came here right out of school. I'm so excited to join InfoSec and security. I'm super excited by Mandiant's APT1 report that, I thought this was the place to be. And 6.5 years later, I'm still here. So clearly I was right. I'm really excited about incident response and red teaming. I do both in my role now, and I'm primarily interested in the cloud. So I've done a lot of talks at some conferences like ShmooCon and Black Hat and Troopers about the cloud, specifically the Microsoft Cloud, Office 365. I think that's like a super interesting space because of all of the clients and organizations that are going there. And it's just, this totally new environment with a lot of investigating on both the red and the blue side. So that's where I spend a lot of my research time. My day-to-day time, I run incident response investigations out of the office in New York here. So a lot of ransomware, which we're going to get into today, but also a lot of interesting, espionage cases, insider cases, has run the gamut in the last 6 years. Outside of InfoSec, I am a very dedicated Green Bay Packers fan. We just recorded this day after a really rough loss. So I'm feeling that one a little bit, but big Green Bay Packers fan. I'm also really into beer, like our former hosts, Nick and Chris. Also really into bourbon, so we might be featuring some special bourbons on other episodes. My current go-to right now is Eagle Rare, which is a superb bourbon if you've never had it before. I think that's me in a nutshell. Oh, I'm really excited about State of the Hack because I was a really big fan of it before with Nick and Chris. I thought they covered some, really interesting topics. It's really hard to kind of gain a stage in InfoSec, unless you're already a Twitter superstar or a conference superstar. And, one of the interesting things that I think they did was kind of talk about some interesting techniques or have some interesting guests on who, may not have that megaphone already. And, they really highlighted some interesting techniques that we've seen, some interesting things that red teamers are doing. And I definitely want to continue that. I definitely want to make this, a community-driven podcast and really talk about, cool things that we're seeing in the field, but also cool things that our peers are doing.
Great. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I think everyone here definitely is really excited to kind of continue the spirit of the 1.0 version of State of the Hack that Nick Carr and Christopher Glyer started, which is kind of building a community-driven information sharing session, right, where we drill down to the technical depth of what matters and really get a chance to highlight contributions from outside, both inside and outside of FireEye, people from the in general InfoSec community. So great to have you on. We'll move over to Mr. Evan Pena.
Hey, Austin, thank you. So I'm Evan Pena. I am a director of professional services in the central region, and I'm also the global red team lead for the red team function. And so a little bit of both hats here. I've been at Mandiant for over 8 years, like 8.5 years at this point. I started in the Alexandria office back before FireEye acquired Mandiant. Had some really good time doing incident response and forensics at the time. This is kind of before a red team even existed. Really at Mandiant, we were doing like very minor pen test work at the time with like me and a guy named Chuck Willis, like a couple of other people, a very small team. Versus where we are now, we're very large, global, all over the world, and do some of the most red teams for any company in InfoSec, which is really cool and really proud to see that growth since I've been here. After I was in LA, I moved to Los Angeles, lived there for a few years as well. I was the regional red team lead for the West Coast at the time. And now I'm in San Antonio, Texas, which is where I'm originally from, and get to finally come back home. Kind of did a little bit of a tour and then came back home after all of that. It's been an honor to be here at State of the Hack. I was actually a former guest back when Chris and Nick were running State of the Hack and or hosting it. And I had some cool research that I like to present. And it's cool to watch because I like that they look on in the industry to see like who's coming out with the latest and greatest research. What are attackers actually doing on the front lines? And we're able to kind of bring that to the show. And I was proud to participate in it at the time when I came out with some research and a cool blog and a tool. And I'm really interested to see, all of us new hosts kind of keep up that whole mantra of, looking for cutting edge research tools, what we're seeing on the front lines. And I think we have a good mixed bag of hosts here, me being the red team lead and getting, a really good understanding of like what research we're coming up with on the red team, what attacks we're using, what we're seeing attackers use that we can apply to the red team. And then a lot of you guys like Austin and Doug that have an incident response background, and obviously Julian, who will come up here in a minute, is a really good collaboration. And I'm looking forward to seeing us all collaborate and talk about some of the cool stuff that we're seeing on the front lines and in the industry.
Yeah, I again, it's great to have someone who's really been sort of knee deep in the red team trenches for as long as you have. And there's no doubt, especially with the topic we're going to be discussing today, that there's going to be a lot of overlap between what red teamers are doing sort of at the bleeding edge of sophistication and how attackers are modifying and picking up those tools. So it'll be good to have that expertise here as well. And last but certainly not least, our good friend to the north, Mr. Julian.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. Hi, everyone. My name is Julian Pileggi. I'm a technical manager for Mandiant in the Toronto, Canada office. So that's the northern neighbor to many of our viewers down in the US. And I'm sure folks around the world have heard of Canada before. If not, hopefully you come and visit us sometime. It's really nice and warm here, if you didn't know. And so I've been doing incident response with Mandiant for just over 5 years now in Canada. And before joining Mandiant, I worked at a large bank doing security operations and incident response for about 5 years as well. So I've got a pretty good background of knowledge in the incident response space. And so I think Evan and I, being co-hosts, will be a great complement to one another, from the red team and blue team perspective. And I'm looking forward to that. It's definitely an honor to be here. This is a pretty stellar show, big shoes to fill with Carr and Glyer. So shout out to those guys for having, established such a strong brand with this, and hopefully we can do them proud. A fun fact about myself, if anyone would like to challenge me, my typing speed is an average 120 words per minute. Not too bad. Peak 165. So if you want to race me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. We can set up a little, fun race just for fun and see how it goes. Thanks.
All right, that's the gauntlet has been thrown. We are just into the very first episode, and we already have the challenge set. So I guess Julian is asking you to at him. So make sure that those of you fast typers out there really give him a run for his money, because honestly, I think I'm speaking for Evan and Doug here. We're getting a little tired of hearing about how fast he is at typing. So if you can set him back a little bit, we'd all appreciate it. And last, but maybe least, I don't know, I guess it depends on your opinion. Myself, so my name is Austin Baker. I am a incident response manager here at Mandiant in the central United States. I am based out of Houston, Texas. I, similarly to both Doug and Evan, got started many, many years ago at Mandiant. Mandiant was actually my first job out of college. So quite a learning curve, really exciting to get thrown into the deep end for both incident response and, at the time, a little bit of red teaming. Got a chance to work with Evan and the team on the red team for several years. Was a very happy member of that, learned quite a bit. And then now I've kind of transitioned back over to the incident response world. And really, I think that my big focus is taking the lessons learned from red teams, taking the lessons learned from the tool development, the work that's going on, and figuring out how we can apply them to the incidents that we're investigating. Because if you're not learning from what's being done on the red team, I think you're really handicapping yourself in terms of being able to respond to incidents appropriately. Fun fact about me, so I am a somewhat new dad, I guess new dad this year. So I have a 7-month-old who's my first child, who keeps me quite busy. And when I'm not doing that, I definitely enjoy playing the occasional PC game and Dungeons and Dragons. I'm a big D&D fan. If you look behind me, you can see some of my figurines and dice. But yes, so that's who we are. And similar to the folks here, State of the Hack was a really cool opportunity for us as FireEye employees and Mandiant to really interact with the security community, to really get to share information publicly about cool things that we're doing, and to invite folks that are out there doing great stuff, really front line research and seeing some of the cool stuff that hackers are trying to do, and elevate them, bring the spotlight on them, kind of shine that light on their research so that everyone can benefit from it. Because that's the end goal, I think, of State of the Hack, and that's really what Mr. Carr and Mr. Glyer kind of started it as. It's an avenue and a place where we can all share the work that we're doing in a way that highlights the cool and unique contributions that everyone brings to the table, like the 4 very different hosts here in terms of our background, but also the members of the community, because that matters a lot to us. Everyone here has worked on presentation talks, is on Twitter, interacting with members of the community. We really value that input, and for us, that's one of the driving factors of being a part of this new version. So I just want to thank everyone, my co-hosts, Doug, the team here, and especially a very special thank you to Mr. Nick Carr and Mr. Christopher Glyer, both of whom I was very lucky to count as mentors, in some cases a manager. But we really are hoping to do well by you, carry on the torch that you set, and really turn this into a community-driven place where we can share ideas and share meaningful information to help protect both our organizations, our customers, and our friends and family. So at this point, I think we'll bid a farewell to our 2 friends who will be doing an episode. Evan, you want to give us a little bit of a sneak peek for your episode in November that we'll be seeing?
Yeah, so in November, we're going to talk about some initial vector payloads that we've been kind of looking into for research and development. And there's going to be a blog and tool release with this episode, so it's going to be pretty cool. I'm not going to give away what the techniques are at this point, but I will say that it's an initial vector technique that allows you to weaponize Office documents, like obviously beyond just the macro, for example, that will still get by some detections today, and how you can also detect on these activities if you see them in the wild, but not very well known, not very public. And again, it's going to be released along with a blog and a tool, so it should be pretty cool. And just for you, those who don't know, my Twitter handle is Evan_Pena 2003. And Julian, you should probably mention yours as well, so people can give you a challenge on this typing challenge.
Julian, you want to?
Yeah, good point. X64_Julian at me, and let's do this.
All right. Well, Evan, Julian, thank you for showing up here. We look forward to your episode next month. Of course, leave it to the red teamers to cryptically tease the release of a tool. But I think everyone's going to be really interested to see what you guys have to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for introducing us, and really welcome to the team.
Take care.
Bye. All right, Doug.
Get down to business.
Yeah, let's get down to business. So really, I think the name of the game for us is trying to tap into what's going on in the field today.
Yeah.
So, Doug, what are you seeing in the news? We'll do a quick round of hot takes. What are you seeing in the news that we need to talk about before we get onto our main content, which is going to be really about a very interesting, very public campaign that we've been responding to. Let's start with the news. What are you seeing? What interests you?
Yeah, I can do some quick takes here. So I think right before actually we started recording this, the Department of Justice issued a new indictment against some GRU attributed hackers for some activities surrounding, anti-doping activities, the Olympics, WADA. It's a really interesting read, the actual indictment, just some of the kind of indicators, some of the tactics that the government is actually calling out, really interesting. I think to me, one of the more interesting points, and this has been documented before, are the use of actual close access teams. So, traditionally in cyber, we think about, someone sitting thousands of miles away in an office somewhere, right, running malware, maybe Cobalt Strike, maybe something custom. In these cases, they were actually kind of acting as like red teamers would. They drove a car up to the front door of an office building with some antennas loaded into their trunk, and tried to hack into Wi-Fi networks that way. So that was a really cool read, a really interesting read. I think you have some interesting quotes from that indictment as well.
Yes, there was a really choice one that's being circulated. It's their cyber attack combined the emotional maturity of a petulant child with the resources of a nation state. So that, if we're talking hot takes, I think that is the hottest take coming out of that indictment. But as you said, it's really interesting because, I very much remember, and I think you do too, the days of our red teams where we load up all of our Wi-Fi antennas into the car and we go park in our customer's parking lot, and we're basically hoping to proxy things. So interestingly enough, I think this is exactly the operation where we saw a very ingenious use of Responder to proxy those kinds of link local requests and multicast name resolution type stuff to proxy it and get credentials that they can then use to log into internet-facing portals, email, VPNs, you name it. So very cool stuff. And I think, who is it that originally kind of broke this? Was it the Dutch security intelligence operations?
The Dutch security services, they actually foiled the attack. And then I can't remember if it was in conjunction with journalists or not, but yeah, this was published back in 2018. And I think this indictment is related to that.
Yes, it definitely mentions that, at least in the initial indictment. So that's pretty cool. In terms of interesting things that caught my eye, obviously you have the new sort of Trickbot takedown attempt. So the latest work by Microsoft, which is fantastic. Anything we can do to help kind of hobble these threat actors from getting these massive networks of Trickbot entities. So first of all, thanks, Microsoft. That's hopefully going to help a lot of people from getting essentially ransomed after the Trickbot infection. So I think time will tell how effective that is at reducing the general flow, because as we will talk about, not every single actor is using Trickbot. But it'll be very interesting to see what kind of long-term these legal efforts or legal avenues will offer in terms of tackling the problem of crimeware, because criminal organizations generally don't respond to subpoenas and legal proceedings.
Yeah, it is the second time in 2 weeks that the Trickbot botnet has been targeted. So previously, US Cyber targeted the Trickbot botnet, trying to take it down, by sending poison config files. And then now we have the actions by Microsoft and the ISP providers to take it down. So I read some article that was saying, immediately after the attack, they saw the number of active Trickbot servers go down to, I think, at least six that this particular provider was tracking. But like you said, remains to be seen how long that stays for. I mean, I think any effort to take down criminal groups is great, but these guys are resilient. They're operating in environments or countries where there is no law enforcement targeted against them. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
I think it's definitely something to watch, and the stuff that's being released around OFAC, especially related to the payment of ransomware threat actors. It's an interesting place where legal is really very pointedly intersecting with the front lines of operations from the security side, and potentially offering maybe an alternate solution to the traditional response, which is, well, you have to secure your own environment, right? You're kind of on your own. The last piece of pretty interesting information. So we all remember zero login. It was a very interesting, very potent authentication bypass vulnerability that allowed essentially you to access domain controllers, really. And in the case of the public exploit, run something like DC sync, where you can then get valid password hashes, carry BTGT hashes to then continue on with privileged operations. So the DFIR report identified at least one case now, according to them, where they saw zero logon being used to deploy, sort of escalate privileges and deploy ransomware. So based on the timeline I saw there, it was 5 hours, I think, was the beginning to end infection to ransomware. What do you think about zero logon? Is this going to be haunting us for months? What's the
the vulnerability itself is pretty crazy, right? Just by sending a crafted request with basically all zeros in one key place, you can gain access to the domain controller. Certainly, everyone should be patching that now if you haven't done it already. But I think what's interesting is there was a lot of discussion about this vulnerability on Twitter from like red team operators saying, you're changing the password of an account, in such a way that you may have unintended consequences, right? You may break replication in the domain. You may at least break functionality on this one domain controller. There's a lot of discussion on Twitter and internally at Mandiant about whether this was something a responsible or an ethical red teamer could use, because of all these impacts. And what's interesting to me, and I think we'll talk about this later on as well, is criminal groups, they don't have those concerns, especially when you're going to deploy ransomware 5 hours later. The threat actor doesn't care if they might take down Active Directory. They're about to do that anyway. So
right, exactly, yeah. Active Directory is coming down whether you want it or not.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just really interesting to see these kind of things play out. And criticism maybe that I've gotten sometimes from clients is, we didn't think this was super realistic compared to some attacks. And I think that's always something red teamers struggle with, right? Is we still, at the end of the day, have to follow the law. We can't take down the business. There are tremendous benefits to having a red team regardless, and a lot of lessons learned. But, we still we're not criminal groups. We're not going to break the law, and we're not going to take down the business. And that's something that we see, right? So, as we start to talk about our main content for today, ransomware and kind of the operations preceding it,
yep.
The FBI, right, in 2019 estimated $3.5 billion in damages for all cybercrime. Most of that was business email compromise, but they don't have a complete picture, I think. They don't see all ransomware, especially because you have to report it, and a lot of firms don't. Some private firms that I've seen, they estimate ransomware damages alone to be between $5 to $8 billion.
Wow.
And I don't know about you, but working on cases, what's the highest ransom for an individual entity that you've seen?
So the highest that I've personally seen was, I think, 7.5, and that was the initial offer. I mean, as you know, these organizations have gotten great at negotiating. So just like you would buy a car or bid on something on eBay, they know that they're expecting a counter offer. Yeah. So it's been interesting to see those develop, and there's a lot of groups out there that are keeping really detailed statistics on how these negotiations will work. What about you? I mean, what are you seeing?
I think I've actually seen 20 million as the initial.
Wow, 20 million.
Yeah, like you said, they're very negotiable. You probably could get it down. If you hire a skilled negotiator, you could probably get it down, 60%, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've seen 20 million as the initial offer. And I know our Intel teams track a couple of Bitcoin wallets and other wallets. And they've seen in 2019, just for one group, $150 million transit through that wallet, which is absolutely crazy to me.
Yeah, that's nuts, especially when you think about where we were in 2014 to 2015, where a real big haul was a couple million credit cards, right? You get some track data, maybe you could clone some cards, maybe you would just sell the numbers on the black market. You'd be lucky to get maybe 100K, 500K if it was a big haul.
Right.
Now we're talking million, like entry point million. Now we're getting the tens of millions per gig. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about because, we've seen an interesting development. Generally, I think that the industry has. We've seen an interesting development over the years where these criminal organizations, previously the ones that used to do things like carding, have moved over to the more lucrative ransomware. And even the ransomware organizations that really started from day one were, they're becoming more sophisticated. They're treating it as a real business enterprise.
Right.
Segmenting out roles and responsibilities. They're no longer handling the end-to-end business. Now they're splitting out access, handoffs, deploying encryption, and meanwhile cutting it all in. And so from what you're seeing on the front lines, how is this new sort of enterprise way of handling ransomware, how is that affecting the way that response has to, tackle these engagements, right? Like, how does it affect the ground level response?
Well, I think it just makes attribution really difficult, and it makes it makes our job as responders really difficult because with specific threat groups, we have their TTPs, we have IOCs assigned to them. With ransomware, it's a little bit different where we're aware of like a general toolbox that all threat actors use, but it's quite a large toolbox. So we definitely have to look for more things. We have to be aware of more techniques. And when the client at the end of the day asks us for attribution, it's not an easy question to answer anymore, because the initial vector may have been by a certain UNC group that we track that uses this specific type of phishing campaign, or they scanned for vulnerable NetScalers, for example, a case I just had. But then the indicators that you find on the endpoints for things like recon and lateral movement, you might see overlap with a totally different group. And then at the very end of the day, the ransomware might be Maze. And Maze operates through an affiliate program, right? Where you join that program, and every person or entity in this kind of chain, they each get some sort of percentage of the ransomware that's paid at the end of the day. So it makes things really tricky from an attribution perspective, especially, but also just as threat hunters, there's more that we have to watch out for, because there's so many people involved now.
Yeah, and I think I'm not alone in sort of noting the kind of, I should call it maybe an arms race, or the sort of arms escalation, where previously, take for example something like Bloodhound. It was released several years ago, and it was fantastic when it was released, but we didn't see widespread adoption from attack groups until much later. Yeah. And now we're actually seeing a much smaller delay, at least I'm seeing a smaller delay in the adoption of these sort of red team tools and these pen testing techniques, and like the zero logon vulnerability, right? The POC has already been co-opted in the real world to deploy ransomware. So how does this escalating, sort of arms race in this timeline, what does that mean that we need to do? Because, you and I both used to red team, and we still try to do it every now and then. What do we need to do as kind of security practitioners to really make sure that these techniques are not being used in this sort of obviously wrong way? Is there anything we can do? It's a tough question. It's a tough question.
Tough question. I just, I think there's just a lot of changes happening right now. A lot of the organizations that we see being targeted, like they don't have big security budgets, because they don't do anything that anyone would think, an APT actor or a nation state aligned actor would be interested in. And traditionally, crimeware and botnets and stuff was more something that I, was worried about happening to my, my mother, my grandparents, than to, the 50 doctor group that serves, my county, right?
Right.
And so now you really have to be vigilant, and organizations of every size have to be. And so, one thing that we can do, I think, is just try and spread the word more. Organizations that make these products can put more efforts into patching, right? And just making secure products. But yeah, it's not an easy question. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I mean,
yeah. And I think this is a perfect piece to note on, that we're very much interested in getting your opinion, people who are watching this, because these are hard questions that we have to tackle, and it's easy to avoid them on Twitter by blocking people and unfollowing people that are potentially asking the question in a difficult way, or raising the issue in a way that makes us feel uncomfortable, that we don't engage with. But hopefully we can promote a space where these kinds of questions we can kind of tackle together. And I think again, having both been red teamers in our careers, I think we both know that offensive security professionals play a vital role in protecting organizations. And the real role they play, I think, again, in my opinion, is protecting the infrastructure and the companies that can afford their services, which are often the most critical and important infrastructure pieces in the country and the world. These are all organizations that have to have these kind of offensive tests on a regular basis. So, everyone knows that we have to do this together. So this definitely is a question I think that we're interested in getting input on, especially on Twitter. So feel free to let us know. Again, you can use the hashtag State of the Hack. Let us know your thoughts. We want to engage on this question in a way that's not accusatory, right? No one here that's looking to secure their clients and protect people is to blame. But it's becoming a really pointed question because it's really affecting us as a community, as well as the mom and pop shops, our families, our coworkers, our friends who we never thought would be affected by ransomware are now being targeted in a very real way. So it's a question to tackle. And I think that really kind of leads us over to really the key topic here that we want to dive into, which is what are the latest campaigns that we're seeing that's really got both breadth in terms of the number of organizations they're after, as well as the depth of techniques and the style of tactics they have. So here's the opening question, Doug. What's KEGTAP?
Yeah, KEGTAP, also known as BazaaLoader, right? There's a lot of good research out there, especially just in like the last week or so about, what this malware is, how it's related to ransomware. But, the long and short of what KEGTAP is from the technical basis is it's a pretty complex in the way that it's constructed piece of malware that really just functions as a downloader, right? Its sole purpose is to keep itself updated and then download and run additional tools. And it's being packaged up in a fairly interesting way through some very, very widespread phishing campaigns. I actually have been a proud recipient of a couple of those emails. So I think we're going to show the phishing that I received along with some of the follow-on activity right now as we go. And we'll also keep this on Twitter as well. But it's, a lot of widespread phishing that honestly reminds me of some of the older lures that some of the Fin groups used to send. So, some of the Fin groups used to send to like our retailer partners emails being like complaint number 12500, for your store location, or, calling about a question. Those are the same email subject lines that we're seeing with these lures, about a complaint, information about annual bonuses, also, of course, COVID related things. And then, the emails themselves are generally using SendGrid links to actually direct the victims to the malware, which I think is pretty interesting. It's something that you and I both have done as red teamers, right? And it's a great way for attackers to leverage some well-established technology for click tracking. SendGrid does provide click tracking, which is very useful to have. You can measure the saturation of your phishing campaigns. You can see how well they're doing. It also gives you a good reputation, right? SendGrid is often whitelisted by proxy providers. It's whitelisted by your email phishing detection engine. It's SendGrid. It's trustworthy. Everyone uses SendGrid. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think these kinds of services have developed over time, where you're seeing legitimate applications. I think I saw on Twitter today that someone was hosting malware on Basecamp, and there's a number of legitimate services out there that we know attackers are using to host malware and even in some cases facilitate command and control activity. And it's because they're trusted and it has that veneer of authenticity. But from what I've seen, they've gone a step further in the KEGTAP campaign. It's not just SendGrid emails. They're doing a significant amount of effort to layer this veneer of authenticity. Yeah. So in your example, the one that you saw, what were they using?
Yeah, so it was SendGrid, and then I actually have two. After that, right, the SendGrid obviously redirects you to somewhere else. In one case, it redirected you to a Google Drive document. It was a PDF with a link, and then that link finally took you to a compromised third-party website that served the malware. I think that's done for a couple of reasons, right? This sort of level of redirections is done to thwart a lot of email analysis technology. A lot of the email sandboxes, they follow maybe one link, maybe two links. Maybe if you pay more money, they'll follow 5 links. So that's definitely part of the rationale there. And then embedding links in PDFs is interesting for the same reason, right? Not all email analysis platforms are going to actually download that PDF, inspect it for the link, and then follow the link. So, it's more holes or more hoops for the user to jump through or the victim to jump through, but it thwarts a lot of technology. And I think something that I'm always surprised at when doing red teams is just how willing victim users are to click through links, to follow the instructions. Once they kind of have read the email and they've decided they're going to trust its contents, the bar is pretty high as far as the amount of effort that they'll put in to run that malware.
I think it's really interesting where you're starting to see sophisticated threat actors like these kind of tap into human psychology in a little bit. The designs of these phishing emails, they are clearly intentionally done to be mass produced and mass distributed, right? They realize they're casting a wide net, but they're also keying in on some obvious phrases like bonus offer, customer complaint, right? They are industry agnostic, but they're looking for keywords that get human attention. And I think that's why, a combination of the wide net as well as these sort of key phrases and images that really are driving engagement is the reason why we're seeing them be so successful. Because there is no doubt that the KEGTAP campaign, the individuals responsible for delivering it, are being successful at a scale that I personally has never seen in terms of the number of industries across the industry verticals that we're seeing affected. So from your perspective, I mean, does this not kind of almost sound like a pretty good red team? Like it almost sounds like exactly what you and I and a number of red teams I know, the kind of effort we put into these campaigns where it's innocuous enough to be disregarded by the people who catch it. Like, oh, this is a bad phishing email, we'll set it aside. Right. But it's compelling enough to catch a lot of individuals that don't have that sophisticated security practice. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. These are basically unsanctioned red teams. And I think that's also demonstrated in the kind of innovation cycle of threat actors, but especially the KEGTAP actor. We saw them using SendGrid directly with SendGrid links. Lately, we've been seeing emails sent directly from compromised domains. I mentioned the links to Google documents. We've also now seen files hosted on Constant Contact, which I didn't even know what that was, but apparently it's a pretty popular email marketing platform. Oh. So they're really swapping things out there. And again, that's probably whitelisted domain. And we've also seen with the actual KEGTAP payloads, they've started to use Unicode in the file names and in the directory paths where they're stored. And I think the reason, again, is they know that Unicode is a tricky area. If anyone's ever tried to program like a Python program that handles Unicode, it's a pain. And it's also a pain for security products and for IOC authors, right? So we'll share a link to this malware sample, and we'll have a slide up here with that file name. So, it looks like print_document, which for any threat hunters who are tracking KEGTAP, it's a very common file name for the payload. But if you actually inspect it in the hex editor, it's actually Unicode. So if you did like a basic search for print document, you wouldn't get any hits. You actually have to search for the O and the C are Unicode characters. So that's really interesting to see that. It's really interesting to see these guys even kind of think of using that. And it probably contributes to some of the high saturation rates here as well.
Yeah, and it's another example. Again, you and I have had these conversations about red teams. It's another example where attackers are becoming aware of incident response processes, which would include, oh, I see this file. Let me run a quick search looking for it in my environment. Oh, we didn't find one. All clear. Well, they know exactly the kinds of tools that we're working with, so they're going to try to exploit a little bit of that methodology. So this is a place where you got to have some really resilient layers of security where a simple string search is not going to be what's protecting you from ransomware, right? So now one thing that I saw that was very interesting before we move on to sort of the second stage of operations that these folks are using is some guardrails, some very weird guardrails.
Yes.
So tell us about what you found.
Yeah, I think this has been documented pretty well, but it's just interesting to note, right? Before KEGTAP actually does its main function, right, which it has two main functions generally. Once it's running, it will attempt to update itself. And then once it's updated, it will install persistence, which I think we'll get to in a second. And then it'll just basically start asking, it's C2, right? Do you have any new files for me to download and run? But before it does all that, it actually checks the language settings and in some places the actual country settings for the device it's on to see if it's in Russia or to see if it's on a Russian language system. And as you might imagine, and everyone listening might imagine, if it is in Russia or running on a Russian language system, it just exits. So, not targeting a particular organization. Instead, they're just saying, okay, we can't target any, entities or any people in Russia. We can all surmise why that might be. But yeah, definitely an interesting guardrail to see that happening. I haven't had any organizations ask me or tell me that they've been setting their system settings to Russian intentionally. Like, I don't know if maybe there's, a clever way that you could hook that function call or something, or maybe if your IT admins all happen to be Russian speaking, that's maybe a good bypass for ransomware. But yeah, definitely an interesting guardrail.
So somewhere there's a Russian speaking employee who is safe because of this guardrail. So
maybe some command controller or Russian. I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll have to add that to the list of remediation guides. So everyone needs to learn their Cyrillic alphabet. But another interesting place where we've seen some development. So, I mean, from the cases I've worked, even as recently as last week, we're seeing a lot of scheduled tasks. We're seeing a lot of link files. Again, they're looking to keep persistence because blind phishing your way in, you don't know how long it's going to take you to get the privileges you need to really hand off for ransomware deployment. Any interesting or new techniques that you're seeing?
Yeah, there's been a couple of instances that we've seen on cases and some public samples that we can link to as well. They're using bits for persistence. And, I think from your red teaming days and mine, right, we remember bits persistence. It's pretty simple. You set a job that happens after the system reboots. It'll go ahead and download something and then run it, basically. And this has been talked about a lot. I think there are some detections in certain products for it. But what's interesting here is what the KEGTAP actors have done is, instead of setting the job to download and then run a legit malware sample, they've actually set it up to first try and download a file from a domain that doesn't exist, or just download a file that doesn't exist. And then you can actually set a failure action in bits. So what they do is they set a failure action to, on failure, run the payload, which has already been stored in disk, somewhere in app data. So a really clever persistence mechanism that, in real time, it's probably not going to get triggered because it has different command line flags. And, from a investigating, the actual artifacts, like the bits database, you kind of have to understand what's going on there, because at first blush, you'd probably just be like, oh, this is a weird bits job that isn't going to work.
Right. And it's that idea that you look at it, you see it won't succeed, and then you can potentially make the mistake of assuming that whatever they tried to do failed.
Yeah.
And we've seen this in many occasions. So this, I think, is a relatively novel example.
Yeah.
But again, we keep coming back to this smell, sort of when we're doing incident investigations, we would say, oh, this kind of smells like a red team, right? This is very pen testy type work that's being done, which I think brings us over into sort of the second piece, which is the areas where they're really co-opting a lot of great tools that we use in red teams and kind of demonstrating the real value they bring to the table. So obviously, once you get a foothold in via KEGTAP, the question is going to be, what can you do with that? So, I've seen some pretty interesting pieces. I think we've seen Bloodhound obviously be used to great effect. We've seen Kerberoasting done. Yeah. And Kerberoasting is a perfect example of a really powerful technique because of the asymmetrical nature of it. It's very quick to execute. Even if you catch it, it does not mean that you're not going to potentially leak valid credentials, because they can still crack them offline and potentially use those credentials before you have a chance to evict the attacker from the network. It's a really frightening example where something that I routinely used on the red team is now being used to kind of show me the kind of war that we're kind of waging here, right? How asymmetrical that power relationship is between, an innocent organization and an actual malicious attacker. What have you seen? What are the kind of tools that you're seeing deployed?
Yeah, we see just a lot of kind of dual use tools, and then a lot of red team tools, like you said. So we've actually started seeing Kerberoot being used in environments, right? Which is, it's only a couple of years old now, but it's used for what what is it again? Kerberoot?
So it's pre-authentication brute forcing of passwords. Shout out to Mr. Rotnop. We were actually, if you remember, at Troopers presenting our talk when that tool was released. So I guess congratulations. This is, I think, the first confirmed use of a threat group actually using this tool, which clearly shows, as we knew on the red team, its power, right? It's a very quiet, very powerful tool for brute forcing credentials that's going to bypass a lot of traditional SIM logging. So it's pretty crazy, I think, to see how this particular threat actor is adapting. And you've got things like WMIC being used to, lateral movement persistence, several different aspects there.
Yeah.
And it's really highlighting, I think, the absence of a focus on mid-level, traditionally space for investigations, mid-level lifecycle type techniques. So, if we're looking at initial phishing payload here and then mission accomplished here, it's this threat actor is really living in that space in between where they do their reconnaissance, they do their privilege escalation. And it's challenging us in a way that I think we haven't really been challenged to move the investigative process as far left of that cycle as we can to catch the threat actors before they have a chance to actually accomplish a mission, which is deploying ransomware. And as we've seen, right, what timeline are we working against here? It's a small timeline.
Yeah, it used to be that a ransomware operation might take a couple of weeks, and that timeline is rapidly shifting. And with KEGTAP, you mentioned the 5 hours. That's certainly the fastest that I've heard of. But I think just at Mandiant, we're doing a couple of investigations now where it's 48 hours, 72 hours, which really doesn't give you much time at all to detect this. And they're doing the standard operations that ransomware guys do. So they're also targeting the backups. They're going to delete those or at least try and encrypt them first. And then they're also targeting the organization for data theft, right? And they're doing the data theft, I think, in some fairly clever ways. I'm not a huge believer in the effectiveness of DLP solutions for most data theft anyway, but these threat actors, they're using tools like Megasync, they're using tools like OneDrive. And I think that's really interesting because from the networking point of view, all of that's encrypted, but also with a tool like OneDrive, you probably have that whitelisted. You're going to see files go to OneDrive all the time. Most organizations are on Office 365. So then it kind of becomes a question of how can you stop that? Well, application whitelisting is something we always try and preach, especially on servers. The recent case that I just finished, the attacker downloaded OneDrive and installed it on a server, and that's probably not something anyone would ever see on a server. So, if you can't do application whitelisting, well, then maybe you can do software inventorying or process tracking on the event logs and start hunting for that thing. But to your point about like Kerbrute and Bloodhound, I think it gets to a big problem in security detection is that you really need to tune your logs to detect those kind of mid-stage activities. Like out of the box, event logging on a domain controller is not going to catch Kerber roasting. It can be set up to do so, but it's not out of the box, and it takes a lot of work. And I think when I'm doing investigations for ransomware or really any case, a lot of questions I get are, well, how did the threat actor get these credentials? How did they get my domain admin credentials? And, I'd be curious I'm sure you encounter that as well. Like, what do you try and tell clients, like, this is how you can actually hunt for these activities or detect them? Like,
yeah, and there's a lot of guidance, and we'll include some links on the Twitter to make sure that we're pointing people to the right kinds of event logs that you can add to look for things like Bloodhound, to look for things like event logging. But I think that the general takeaway here is that these actors are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They're leveraging tools in a really effective way. And that what we thought was sort of the simple domain of, oh, you just throw some security tools, maybe some AV, and it'll stop it. Well, this is a perfect demonstration of why a defense in-depth approach is necessary. So, KEGTAP is a really interesting campaign. I'm sure we're going to be watching it for several weeks, maybe months, depending on how resilient this attacker is proving to be. And they are incredibly resilient to the efforts we have to stop them, and everyone out in the security community as well. So yeah, for us, it's keeping an eye on it, making sure that we're sharing the techniques as we find them, and making sure that we can give you the folks out there information to help protect yourselves, protect your friends, organizations that you rely on from kind of falling prey to a similar incident, which unfortunately is looking increasingly more likely as we go. So in terms of the first episode, Doug, I think that's it. I think we're at time here. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Again, we're looking to kind of create this community interaction and exchange information to help each other improve and really better protect the folks out there from these kinds of threats. So I appreciate you tuning in. Yeah, so this has been episode 1. Thanks everyone for attending, and stay safe out there.